I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but I would encourage you as we end chapter 12 in Acts this week and we begin chapter 13 next week. Chapter 13, I'm developing a sermon series based on that chapter entitled, Here Am I, Send Me. And that's kind of going to be the theme of the entire 13th chapter of Acts. I think we're going to take some time to get through that chapter. But there's, as I have been studying ahead and working ahead, there is wonderful content within that I can't wait to preach. Which brings me to today. You know, there's some sermons you get very excited about as a preacher. There are messages, there are things that you care about, that you're passionate about, that you really like, and they're more fun. I mean, good messages. I mean, there's nothing more fun than preaching about God's grace. Like all the things that Rex was talking about this morning, those are the most fun things to talk about, is how there's the terrible justice of God that falls upon all those who deserve it. But the good news is you can not have what you deserve. And that's stuff like that's so fun to preach because it gives people inspiration and hope. Then there's lessons like today. Lessons like today are cautionary tales. And they're all throughout Scripture as well, which it doesn't mean that they're not also lessons that are honoring to God, because this lesson even in itself is entitled 3 Reasons to Honor God, but it comes from a negative perspective because there's really not a whole lot else you can do with the text. So having said that, we'll backtrack to no, I'm getting ahead of myself again. So let's just go straight into it. 3 reasons to honor God, if you like to fill out your outline. Number 1, only fools oppose Him. Only fools oppose God. Psalm 14, verse 1 says, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God." And someone might make the argument, well, Wes, you know, there's just some people that don't believe in God. I mean, isn't it reasonable to just consider that, shouldn't you feel sorry for a person who doesn't believe in God? I mean, you believe in God and good for you, but some people just don't. And how can you be so harsh against people that don't believe? Well, here's the thing, church. I believe with all of my heart that in order to not believe in God, that is something you must choose for yourself. It's not something that comes naturally. What comes naturally is to believe in a Creator as a base point, as a base beginning, and then to either pursue that thought and that idea, or to pursue your own thoughts and ideas. And that's really the first crossroads that you come to when it comes to your faith in life. What am I going to pursue in my belief? Most people pursue themselves. They don't pursue God. And say, well, is all this just your opinion? No, none of this is actually my opinion, though it may sound that way. All of these things I'm talking about right now come from the Bible. For instance, Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 22. Paul says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness." You say, well, I know people that don't believe in God, but I wouldn't necessarily say that they suppress the truth. If a person says there is no God, if a person chooses to force that idea upon themselves, they are suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. And here's how Paul explains why that is so. Excuse me, goodness. Verse 19. "Because that which is known about God is evident within them." Does that apply to all people? That applies to all people, no exceptions made. All people, okay? Is evident within every person that there is a God. For God made it evident to them. That's how they know. Verse 20, "For since His creation of the world, His invisible attributes, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that They are without excuse. Now, those are key words. They are without excuse. So a person may say, well, I don't believe in God. I can't help that. You say all this, Wes. No, the Apostle Paul gives us the deep theology behind what people believe and why they believe it. He says, look, God has made himself known to mankind, to all of mankind. And if you don't believe it, and if you try to use any excuse whatsoever, God will accept none of those. God will one day say to that person, you knew good and well that I existed, and you suppressed the truth of me in unrighteousness. Verse 21 goes on, for even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Now, the farther and farther you push away the idea of God, the more and more you are not going to believe. That is true. And the more it's going to appear, you may even be able to sell to people, well, I don't believe and I've never believed. And let me give you the reasons why. But look at what verse 22 says. That's where the real hammer falls on the verse. Professing to be wise, they become fools. They became fools. Church, this makes up a vast majority of our world. People who profess to become wise, who are truly fools. And I apologize. Give me just 1 second here. I thought about trying to fight through it, but I don't think I could make it. Okay. Acts 12, 18 and 19. Going back to our verses, or getting to our verses, our first verses of the day. Now when day came, there was no small disturbance among the soldiers as to what could have become of Peter. This may be the greatest understatement that Luke writes in all of the book of Acts. It's not how I would have said this sentence as I thought about it and pondered this. Now, who talks like this? Well, apparently Luke. But when day came, there was no small disturbance. Saying there was no small disturbance is the opposite way of saying when day came, there was a huge disturbance among the soldiers as to what had become of Peter. When Herod had searched for him and had not found him, he examined the guards and ordered that they be led away to execution. This is the execution of 16 Roman guards. That is not a small deal. Then he went down from Judea to Caesarea and was spending time there. So, Peter, we remember from last week, he is chained to 2 Roman soldiers in the prison. Peter is guarded by 14 additional Roman soldiers. Okay? He's locked in a jail cell. So even if he weren't attached to those guys and he could somehow knock them all out, he still has the locked jail cell to contend with. Herod denies God by denying the supernatural. What do you think those Roman soldiers said in their defense to Herod? What happened? Where'd Peter go? You have 16 of the most elite fighting soldiers on the face of the planet. And what explanation are they going to give? It's a miracle. It had to be his God. What else are they going to say? They're not going to try to cook up some kind of other conspiracy. Peter's friends came in and overpowered us. Have you seen Peter's friends? They're not the overpowering type. There is no explanation except for the supernatural. Much of life is like that, though. There are many things in life where there is no explanation except the supernatural, but it is flatly denied by those who don't want to believe. So instead, what Herod does is he runs away from the disappointed Jews. Why are the Jews disappointed? Because Herod has just executed the apostle James, and the people loved him for that. So then he arrested Peter, and he was about to make this great show of executing the apostle Peter, the leader of the apostles. And the people are super excited about that. And the feast is over with. And then on the morning that he sends to get him, to bring him out before the people to execute him publicly, he's gone. So what he does anyway, instead, is he executes those Roman soldiers. Now those people lost their life because, and only because, Herod denied that the supernatural was possible. He denied God. In Exodus, the Pharaoh did the same thing. History just continually repeats itself. If we go back, we see the first major time that a person thought that they could go to battle against God. Moses demands that the Israelites be freed by God's command, and Pharaoh says no. God turns all the water in Egypt to blood. Moses says, let them go. He says, no. God sends a plague of frogs. God says, let them go. He says, no. Pharaoh says, no. God sends a plague of lice. Then he sends a plague of flies. Then he kills the Egyptians' livestock, but not the other people's livestock, just the Egyptians. Then God sends boils on man and beast. Imagine your body being broke out in boils all over, but not just the people, the animals of the people. God destroyed the land with hail. Then God sent a plague of locusts. In between every single one of these, God is telling through Moses, let the Israelites go. God covers the land with supernatural darkness. And finally, God kills the firstborn children of Egypt. And Pharaoh seemingly lets Israel go, but then he even changes his mind then and pursues him and still denies. Now, this is what it looks like to pick a fight with God. This is what it looks like when God says, here I am, and you say, no, that's not God. No way that's God. I can still win. I can still overcome that. So the Pharaoh, the reason why I say the Pharaoh is, his name was not Pharaoh. Pharaoh is a title. It's like king or president. So the Pharaoh denied God, and he lost everything. He lost all of the labor for his nation. He lost his firstborn child. Then he lost his entire army, and then he lost his own life. So Herod denied God. What will he lose? Let's read on. The second reason to honor God is to avoid disaster. To avoid disaster. Like I said, these are good reasons to honor God, but I don't like looking at reasons to honor God from a negative perspective. But like I said, that's what the text gives us this week, so that's what we'll go with. And I'll have a positive spin on it at the end. We're going to be in Daniel chapter 5. Now I'm just going to skip around through Daniel chapter 5 just to avoid reading the entire chapter. But look at this wonderful example from the life of Belshazzar, the son who took over after King Nebuchadnezzar died. Belshazzar gave orders to bring the gold and silver vessels which Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. They drank the wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Suddenly, the fingers of a man's hand emerged and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing. Then the king's face grew pale, and his thoughts alarmed him, and his hip joints went slack, and his knees began knocking together. Skipping ahead to verse 18, he sends for Daniel. No one can tell him what this means, but Daniel knows what it means. Daniel is brought in, and in verse 18, Daniel says, O king, the Most High God granted sovereignty, grandeur, glory, and majesty to Nebuchadnezzar your father. Because of the grandeur which he bestowed on him, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language feared and trembled before him. Whomever he wished, he killed, and whomever he wished he spared alive, and whomever he wished he elevated, and whomever he wished he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit became so proud that he behaved arrogantly, he was deposed from his royal throne, and his glory was taken away from him. He was also driven away from mankind, and his heart was made like that of beasts, and his dwelling place was with the wild donkeys. He was given grass to eat like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he recognized that the Most High God is ruler over the realm of mankind, and that he sets over it whomever he wishes. Yet you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart. Here's the key words. Even though you knew all this, you were taught by your father who the true God is of this world. Nebuchadnezzar knew, and he passed on that information to you. Yet, look at what you did with the information. You rejected it. You rejected God. But you have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven, the God in whose hand are your life breath and all your ways, you have not glorified. This is the interpretation of the message. God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. You have been weighed on the scales and found deficient. Your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and Persians. And that same night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain. So a life that could have been a life like his father's, a ruler of basically the entire known world at the time, comes to a tragic end because instead of glorifying God, he chooses to glorify himself. Now, what makes his punishment so, what brings about his punishment and makes it so harsh is those key words that we read earlier. He knew who God was. When you know who God is, and the more you know about God, the greater amount of accountability you bring into your own life before God. It's better to not know him or to not know anything about him whatsoever and dishonor him than it is to know all about him and still dishonor him. The next verses in Acts, going back to our scene. Now Herod was very angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon. Why was he angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon? We don't know. I even read external history. Well, we don't have any idea why he was angry and upset with the people of Tyre and Sidon. He just was. So with one accord, those same people came to him, and having won over Blastus, the king's chamberlain, they were asking for peace because their country was fed by the king's country. So whatever beef Herod had with the people of Tyre and Sidon, their leaders came together and said, hey, we've got to make peace with this guy because all of our grain, all of our food comes from Israel, and he's mad at us. They're going to starve us out. Remember what we talked about in the last chapter. There was a famine that was prophesied was coming into the land, and the church at Antioch raised that money to send to Jerusalem so that they would have funds available once the famine came. Well, this looks like the beginning of the famine has come in, and the people know that they're going to need food. They have to make peace with Herod to get it. On the appointed day, this was a day of a feast, we're told by Josephus, and having put on his royal apparel, took his seat on the rostrum and began delivering an address to them. Now, the Jewish historian who wrote, not for the Jews, but he wrote history of the Jews for the Romans, you can read this in the Antiquities of the Jews by Josephus. Josephus said that on this event, Herod was wearing a robe that was inlaid from top to bottom with silver. It had silver sewed into it, so that when he stepped up onto the rostrum before the people, with the sun shining on him, he was shining. I mean, there was a light emanating from him from the reflection of all the silver of his garment. And so here's what the people cry out. The people kept crying out, "The voice of a God and not of a man." Now you also have to consider, they don't really believe that Herod is a god. He's mad at them. He controls their food supply. They are trying to win this guy over, and he's very easily won over. So they're yelling out the voice of a God and not of a man. Shame on them for doing that. But it says, and immediately an angel of the Lord struck him because he did not give God the glory. And he was eaten by worms and died. Now, the more detailed account of this, which we find in the secular history, like I said, of Josephus, Josephus says that suddenly, in the midst of his speech, as the people were cheering, Herod suddenly grabbed his stomach, went down on his knees. People had to come, his attendants had to come, and they took him to his bedchamber, where he laid in agony for a week. And then upon the examination of his body, there was intestinal worms of some parasitic worms of some type inside of him that were eating him from the inside out. A slow, terrible, painful death. Now, this is a very rare insight, and I think whenever we have an opportunity to see things like this, we should especially pay close attention. The supernatural goes on around us all the time. We can't see it, so we start to believe maybe the supernatural isn't going on around us all the time. When we have a sneak peek at the way God works in the world around us at times, it's good to pay attention to those things. Note the reason why the angel struck him. Now, the angel struck him dead because he didn't give God glory. Something we may not think is as severe as, say, the crime of murder. Murder is a crime, and a terrible crime. Not giving the proper glory to God is a crime. But I think very few people would say that not giving God the right amount of glory is as bad as murder. Yet, Herod murdered the apostle James, and he wasn't struck by God. An angel was not sent to kill him. Yet, when he does not honor God, so what's going on here? What's going on here is the Lord is building his church. What's going on here? The Lord is establishing his church and building his assembly of people. And a man stood in between God and his purpose. And when a person stands in between God and his purpose, it's like stepping in front of a freight train going full blast. That's the end of you. Don't ever try to step between God and his eternal purposes, especially as his enemy. Reason number 3 to honor God. His plan will not fail. There's a positive one. His plan will not fail. Isaiah chapter 8, verse 10 says, devise a plan. This is to the Lord's enemies. Devise a plan, but it will be thwarted. State a proposal, but it will not stand, for God is with us. So when we look around the world, it may not seem that God is with us, but we have to remember this isn't a short game. This is not a sprint. This is a marathon. It's the long game. And the reason why God is so gracious to those who are doing evil in this world today, the reason why we don't see more people being struck dead for not honoring God, is because we live in a great time of God's grace and God's patience. And God is still drawing those people to him. I myself was one of those people. One of those people who stood opposed to God. Why did I stand opposed to God? I didn't stick my chest out and say, I oppose you, God. But I said, I want to do what I want to do. And I think that if I follow Jesus, I'm not going to get to do what I want to do anymore. So then I stood in opposition. It wasn't that I didn't want to fight God. I just didn't want to give up what I wanted. That's how I stood in opposition. People still stand in opposition the same way today. Isaiah chapter 14, verses 24 and 27. The Lord of hosts has sworn, saying, surely, just as I have intended, so it has happened. And just as I have planned, so it will stand. For the Lord of hosts has planned, and who can frustrate it? And as for his stretched out hand, who can turn it back? It is a fool's errand to fight against God. Let's further illustrate this. Jeremiah 36:3. Jeremiah writes, the Lord says through Jeremiah, perhaps the house of Judah will hear all the calamity which I plan to bring on them, in order that every man will turn from his evil way. Then I will forgive their iniquity and their sin. That's always been God's direction to his preachers. Go and tell the people, go and warn the people. You don't want to fight against God. Maybe, and the reason for doing that, look at the reason behind that. Perhaps they will hear about how bad it could be, and then they'll turn from their evil. Then I will forgive their iniquity and their sin. See, God always has what is best in mind for mankind, even as mankind is rebelling against him. He still has what's best in mind. We should be children of our Father in heaven and want what's best, even for those who are standing in rebellion against God. It takes a lot of spiritual maturity to get there, but as I tell myself, Wes, I know you don't feel that way in your heart. Fake it till you make it. You know how you fake it till you make it? You don't want to pray for someone because you don't like them. You pray for them anyway. And you know what I've learned just through personal experience? When you consistently pray for someone that you don't like, the bitterness of that feeling of dislike against that person fades. You stop. It's not that you like their actions, and it's not that you agree with, and it's not that you accept their actions. But you change your mind's perspective of, I want them to get what they deserve, to I want them to know Jesus. Isn't that what we should want for everyone? That's what I would want for everyone. Acts 22 verses 22 through 24, Peter preaching on the day of Pentecost, an excerpt from his sermon. Peter said, "Men of Israel, listen to these words. Jesus the Nazarene, a man attested to you by God with miracles and wonders and signs which God performed through him in your midst, just as you yourselves know. This man delivered over by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God." It was all part of the plan. It was part of the plan that Jesus die. It was part of the plan that Jesus die the way that he died. And he goes on to explain that. You nailed to a cross by the hands of godless men and put him to death. But God raised him up again. God had a plan to redeem mankind. You thought you could kill his plan by killing Jesus. All you were doing was executing God's plan. But don't think that you're going to get off the hook. Don't think that because it was part of God's plan that Jesus died, that you're off the hook for being responsible for his death. You are responsible for his death. And not only can we, in this room, we say, well, I'm glad I wasn't one of those people. Peter goes on to explain that we are those people. We're the same as those people. So we can't say that's them, not me. Putting an end to the agony of death, since it was impossible for him to be held in its power. God's plan always works out, even when it looks like there's no way this could even be part of God's plan. How could it be God's plan that Jesus is humiliated the way that he is, that he's whipped publicly the way that he is, that he's crucified publicly the way that he is, with great crowds of people cheering for him to die? How on earth could that ever be part of the plan? You know, we even have songs that we sing about that, and Thomas's song. How could that be part of the plan? But it was. Romans 8:28 tells us that even God takes the things that we don't understand, that seem like the worst things in the world, even though they be sinful, even though they be terrible things, God has the power to bend even the sinful actions of man to accomplish his will. His plan always wins. Last verses. But the word of the Lord continued to grow and be multiplied. There's just your example. No matter what the leaders tried, and there's always been leaders, world leaders that have opposed God, the word of the Lord continued to grow and be multiplied because that was the Lord's plan and it works. And then a verse we'll pick up again next week. And Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had fulfilled their mission. What was their mission? Remember, we have to go back a chapter and we have to remember what it was. So it says they returned from Jerusalem. So what was Barnabas and Saul doing in Jerusalem? Well, they were delivering the money that the church in Antioch raised to give to the church in Jerusalem to help them through the famine. Remember, at the end of chapter 11, it said that the money that the church in Antioch raised, they entrusted to Paul and or to Barnabas and Saul, and they took it to Jerusalem and delivered that. So we know they made it there with all the money, and they delivered the money. They didn't run off with it and live in luxury somewhere on the coast. So their return, it says, and Barnabas and Saul returned. Or where did they return to? Well, they went right back to Antioch, which we're going to see in the first verses. You read the first 3 verses of chapter 13, you'll see they went right back where they came from. They went back to the church in Antioch, where they were working. Taking along with them John, who was also called Mark, which we're introduced to a new character we're going to see throughout the book of Acts. A controversial character, as we're going to see. This person, you might just make a mental note, this person who is named John, who's also called Mark, some call him John Mark. He also is the author of the book of Mark, the Gospel of Mark in your New Testament. So just a little side note there. So, but take these home today. Okay, so here are the things I want you to take home with you today that I'm going to try to take home myself. Number 1, don't deny God. Don't deny His existence. Don't deny His power. Don't deny His moving and acting and being in the world today. Honor Him with your words and honor Him with your actions. It's the very best sacrifice that you can offer to God today in the things you say and the way that you treat other people. Number 2, avoid disaster. Well, we all want to avoid disaster, so these are easy ones to want to be on top of. Give God the glory that is due Him. That's the simple message there. Don't give yourself glory and credit for anything. You know, I have a friend named Hugh who goes with me to Honduras from the church in Tulsa. And my friend Hugh, people compliment him all the time about how hard he works. And he's very uncomfortable with compliments. So he always turns those compliments back to God. And I really appreciate the way that he does that. He never says, well, yeah, you know, I'm a man's man. I'm a real man. I'm a hard worker. He never says anything like that. You know, but he always says, you know what, Wes, he says, because I always compliment Hugh. I can't help it. I mean, the guy's, how old is Hugh? Is he in his 70s, Rex? He's in his 70s. I mean, and I've never seen anyone that I felt like they could legitimately outwork him. And I'm like, Hugh, I mean, dude, slow down a little bit. You're making the rest of us all look bad. And he says, Wes, he says, the Lord blessed me with a weak mind and a strong back. And he says that, you'll hear him say that 100 times on the trip because that's his like one line of turning it back to God. But I really appreciate that. No matter what you take pride in, maybe your intelligence, it may be your ability to do your job. It could be anything for lots of different people. It could be anything. When you take pride for something, you are robbing God of His glory. If you're good at anything, or if you've achieved anything in life, it's not a small thing. It's a big deal to just thank God for that. Thank you, God. I mean, it doesn't mean that you don't have that ability that you have, but just recognize where that came from. If you're in a position of leadership, recognize where that came from. If you're good at something, recognize that God gave you the ability to do that. And give Him the glory, give none to yourself. I try to focus on that myself as much as I can in life. And number 3, accept God's plan. You know, only fools reject it, only fools fight against God. But more than accepting God's plan, well, whatever God's going to do, He's going to do. Ask God and look for opportunities to join Him. God is at work in the world all the time. Now, my constant prayer, and I pray this will be your constant prayer as well, Lord, as I approach this new week, please give me opportunities to glorify You in what I say to others and in what I do. Give me opportunities to serve others this week and to fulfill that second of the greatest commandments and prove that first commandment true, that I love you by the way that I serve and love others. This morning, the greatest thing that you can do for God, and not because He needs it, it's because He loves you and He wants it. The greatest thing you could do for God if you don't belong to Him is confess that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, before these witnesses, and be baptized. Those are the greatest things you could do today, to express your faith that you believe in Jesus, and that you accept God's plan and you throw yours away. It's the greatest way you can honor Him today. If there's anything we can do to help you this morning, please come forward as we stand and sing.
Satisfied with just a country low, a little silver